Hi everybody, welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for Wednesday, the 9th of October, where we are putting some closure onto the fiction section and moving ahead to the drama section. So the last two short stories in our fiction section are Battle Royal from the novel Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, not The Invisible Man, which is the science fiction story, and Popular Mechanics by Raymond Carver. And I think both of these pieces, while very different from one another, are obviously important in terms of their social statement, if nothing else. And Battle Royal is part of a chapter, as I had indicated, of the novel Invisible Man. And what we have is the Invisible Man looking back at his youth when he's been asked to deliver a speech to the leading citizens of the town. I can't help but think of young Goodman Brown, for instance, when Goodman was on his journey and he met some of the leading citizens of his town and was horrified to see that they could be involved in evil. And the same thing happens with Battle Royal. Note that the leading citizens of the town are men. Definitely the theme of sexism is addressed in this piece, as well as racism and classism, if you were to read the novel in its entirety. And there's a lot of black and white imagery because obviously the piece is discussing race relations, but note how white and black mix throughout the short piece that we've read. For instance, the tuxedos that the men are wearing would, of course, be black and white. And the men are smoking black cigars. In other words, they're consuming things that are black. And you'll see this over and over again in the novel as a whole. One of the reasons why I respect the novel so much is because it really maintains the level of detail and depth that you would expect in a short story, but it does so over several hundred pages in novel form. And of course, we have a narrator who's talking about how he's invisible, not necessarily literally invisible in the supernatural sense, but he's invisible because he's seen or not seen as an individual, but he's only seen because of the color of his skin. And he's hopeful at in his youth that if he delivers this speech that he can convince others that he has value and worth. And instead what he ends up finding out is that they could care less, and in fact they've set up a system where they're going to get a perverse entertainment show with a literal battle, a boxing match with Invisible Man and his peers. And this is symbolic of the battles that the disenfranchised have to fight every day in order to survive in society. And Invisible Man finds out very quickly that the battle has also been rigged so that he's left with the strongest, baddest boxer, whom the Invisible Man tries to convince to fix the fight so that they could end this atrocity, and ultimately he can deliver a speech which is of primary importance to Invisible Man. And the fellow boxer tells him no. And the reality is that this is the only way that anyone in this rigged system can get any kind of respect is by winning this brutal and unfair and barbaric and rigged boxing match. And the Invisible Man talks about how he's black and blue. And again, think about color imagery. I mean, literally, he's black, but also the idea of being blue, not just because he's been punched, but because he's sad. If you read the novel, you'll see that the blues also play a very large part in this particular piece. But before Invisible Man delivers his speech, he talks about his grandfather, who on his deathbed had indicated that he was a spy in the enemy's country and had lived with his head in the lion's mouth. And the family's horrified because they say that he had been the meekest of men. So one assumes that on one's deathbed, one would tell the truth. And basically what grandfather is saying by being a spy in the enemy's country is that he basically has been a kind of double agent, if you will, and that the enemy's country would be Caucasian society, and that he basically has been playing a role of meekness, in order to gather recognizance information so that he could use that to overthrow the society that exists. In other words, he's been living with his head in the lion's mouth. So can you imagine how dangerous that would be? Now, Invisible Man and his family don't understand what the grandfather was suggesting, and Invisible Man won't understand until he's much older. But the Battle Royal helps the Invisible Man in his journey to begin to understand what grandfather is saying. And when grandfather says overcome them with yeses, again, the idea is just to pretend to be meek in order to be able to ultimately realize your end goal. So, the leading citizens of the town, and I warn you, if you haven't finished this piece yet, it is ugly, it is brutal, it is disturbing, probably the most difficult piece to read of the semester. Not because it's complex, but because it is so awful in terms of the kind of cruelty that humanity can impose upon its fellow creature. It also is a historical document of what the time period would have been, where certainly racism was much more overt. That's not to say that racism doesn't exist today, and I always challenge my students to watch the news. I think there's much to be learned about how little we seem to have learned from our own past. But nevertheless, what we have here is before the boxing match occurs, the boxers are humiliated by being presented a naked blonde. This is particularly significant because it was in effect illegal for a black man to be looking at a white woman, especially an unclothed white woman. That could result in imprisonment, that could result in torture, that could result in death. And the fact that these boxers are very scantily attired in their boxing briefs and are unable to hide their physical excitement just adds insult to injury. And of course, the leading citizens, the white men of the town, are enjoying watching their humiliation and embarrassment. The white woman is objectified, talking about how female oftentimes is objectified, so that's symbolic. And by being naked, we see the truth when you take off your clothes. And what we see is a tattoo of an American flag. And this piece is very much an examination of the American dream, which is suggested is available to everybody. But Invisible Man talks about that no, it's not. You need to be of a certain ethnicity and gender and class and religion. And when you go down the checklist, you would see that basically very a very small percentage of individuals fit into all of the criteria for American Dream. That the majority is left to fight the battle, basically for the crumbs, while those in power watch and are entertained and profit off of that. So, certainly the Invisible Man is fighting his own personal battles as he's fighting this literal battle with wanting to prove his self worth and thinking that he still has an opportunity to do so rather than being horrified and objecting to the mistreatment that he's being subjected to. And that American flag tattoo. Because it's something that the men can look at but they can't touch, they can never realize. It's a great symbol for the promise of America itself. It's something that's dangled in front of the disenfranchised as opportunity, but it's something that they can never realize. And then ultimately, at the ending of the battle, the boxers are supposed to be paid. We find out that that's fake, just like everything else is fake. It's tokens on an electrified rug. Electricity is a major theme in this particular novel, if you were to read the novel in its entirety, because electricity is a symbol for or power. Who has it, who doesn't. And basically these tokens are on an electrified rug, so they are basically electrified every time they reach for them, and then they find out that these tokens aren't even real money, so it's all an illusion. So you've got to suffer to be paid and then realize you're not even getting anything of any worth. Finally, he gives that graduation speech where he talks about um, in theory, social responsibility, but at one point he makes an error and says social equality. Those are two very different things. That silences the room immediately. No one was really paying attention up until that point. He has to justify his mistake by saying he was swallowing blood. One of my favorite lines in there because he's literally and figuratively swallowing blood. And then ultimately they, quote, reward, unquote, him by giving him in a briefcase wrapped in white tissue paper, no less. Again, the black and white symbolism, and think about how thin and insubstantial tissue paper is to show that so is the contents under the tissue paper, which is a scholarship to the, quote, Negro, unquote, college. And Invisible Man is just thrilled because he thinks this is going to lead to hope and opportunity. And as I had indicated last class, when you read the novel in its entirety, you'll see that he does go to college, but he realizes that that system has been rigged as well, and that education really is going to lead to respect and opportunity only for a few, and certainly not for him because of the color of his skin. But you can get a sense that this is what is going to be happening through the ending of this short story, when Invisible Man has a dream, a nightmare, if you will, about his grandfather. And obviously the specter of his grandfather just continues to haunt Invisible Man. It almost reminds me of Rose for Emily, where Emily is under the crayon portrait of her father. It's very similar with Invisible Man. The picture of his grandfather is always there, literally and figuratively, but nevertheless he dreams is at a circus, which could be a great metaphor for life itself. It's a kind of circus. And the grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns, the idea that the grandfather won't do what's expected of him. And clowns are interesting because while they're supposed to be humorous, there also is something sinister underneath them. If you're a Stephen King fan and you know It, then you understand what I'm suggesting here. And then ultimately the grandfather tells him to open up an envelope, and it's an envelope within an envelope within an envelope. Reminds me almost of those nesting dolls. And finally he gets to a message to keep this N boy running. And yes, the N word is used. As I said, this is a very ugly, difficult, uncomfortable piece to read, but it very much is indicative of its time period. And the idea is that the Invisible Man is going to be treated like a hamster on a wheel, continually exerting effort but getting nowhere. So that's our foreshadowing of what's going to be happening throughout the course of the novel, which, again, I highly recommend when you have the time and the energy to read. I suspect this might not necessarily be the best time as we are approaching midterms. And I'll transition to that because, as you know, midterms means our first paper. Though you can certainly hand it in at any point, and thank you for those of you who have already started handing in papers. And I have a due date of the 21st of October, which is Monday, which puts us halfway through the semester. It would be very good to have a formal grade by that point. And as you know, we've been talking about possibilities of topics and some of the conventions of writing. I can't remember if I had mentioned to you that you should try to avoid the use of I believe, I will argue. If for no other reason, it's considered wordy. You don't have to say, I think Invisible Man is being mistreated. You could say Invisible Man is being mistreated, because ultimately the entire paper is what you think. And also, if you are quoting, and it's a long quote, generally speaking, the way we define a long quote is anything over 3 lines of text. Not 3 sentences, but 3 lines of text. That what you would do is indent that text so that it looks like a block. So it's very easy to see its start point and its end point. So you're probably familiar with seeing block quotes in, let's say, books, for instance. And there is just a slight difference with the way that we format, and a slight difference in the way that we document. So in addition to blocking off that quote by indenting in the margins, you also do not need to use quotation marks. The whole point of a quotation mark is to indicate that you are quoting. But once you've blocked off some text, what you are telling the reader is that you're quoting. The reason why you do it is because usually when you see a quotation mark, you assume that the closing quotation mark is coming relatively soon. But if you've got a long quote, then you don't know when that closing quote, or when the closing of that quote is coming, which is why we block it off. And that means if you're blocking it off, you don't need to use quotation marks. And in this instance, you put punctuation first and then parenthetical documentation, which is the exact opposite of what you do when you are incorporating a quote within your text. I honestly don't know why. It's just one of those rules that you have to follow. And again, the MLA discusses this, the GCC website discusses this, your textbook talks about this as well. My past class videos have talked about this. But the idea behind the first paper is that you have the opportunity to actually write a paper and get my feedback on it. And you have the opportunity to revise it for a higher grade. So once I've returned it to you, if you're content with your letter grade based on content and based on grammar and mechanics, then you're fine. But if not, you can rewrite it for a higher grade, taking my comments into account, talking to me if you need further direction, and you've got up until the ending of the semester to submit in that revision along with the original, which would have my comments on it so I can compare and contrast. You get the higher of the two grades. So I'd like to see the first paper as a kind of learning opportunity. You'll write a similar kind of paper for paper number 2 on drama, which is what we are going to be transitioning to today. But we still have one short story left. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Popular Mechanics by Raymond Carver. And it is a very short story indeed, about a page and a half long or so. And an example of minimalistic writing. So less is more, which we had talked a little bit about with Hemingway and Soldier's Home, but especially with something like Raymond Carver. As you can see, it's only a page and a half. It's mostly dialogue driven. And you might have noticed that there are no quotations used in this dialogue, which I think helps to universalize the dialogue, because usually when you put quotation marks, you're attributing that quote to a particular person or persons. And it also, I think, illustrates how there really is no need to document the conversation which occurs during a breakup, because it basically is the same conversation with minor variances. A little bit of cursing. I'm glad you're leaving, you son of a bitch. I'm glad you're leaving, for instance, as I paraphrase from the text. And then the ultimate argument that begins with possessions. For instance, we're told about the baby's picture. Of course, that's supposed to be some foreshadowing and symbolism for the actual child. Of course, you can't rip a picture in two because you would ruin the picture. Keep that in mind as we're talking about the argument that this couple, and we don't know if they're married or not because it doesn't matter. We don't know why they're breaking up because it doesn't matter. All that matters is the welfare of the child, which is something that's ignored right from the very beginning. The tone is set, it's very dark, that the snow is melting into dirty water and it's getting dark inside too. The window that we're told about is not a large, expansive window that you can look out of. It's not the Mrs. Mallard window of the Story of an Hour, or even the window the Sorrowful Woman looks through. It's a tiny shoulder height window. So again, the sense of claustrophobia. Their argument moves into the kitchen, which is usually considered the center of the home and a place of safety. It'll be anything but for this couple, as they're both arguing over the child. At one point, even using the pronoun it, that she would have it, this child. And of course, the child isn't an it, but they're treating the child as if it's a possession. When they knock over and break a flower pot, in other words, they've broken something that is alive, more foreshadowing about what's going to happen. And we aren't given the specifics of what happens, and that's usually the power of the writer, allowing the imagination to take over. We know that both of them, both parents, are pulling as hard as they can on either side of the child. It's a tug of war. Think of a wishbone, if you will. And if you've got two adults using all of their force, and obviously the baby is in distress, the baby goes from crying to being red-faced and screaming. And the baby is held over a stove, which is a very dangerous place. Both adults pulling as hard as they can, the end result is going to be that child is ripped in two. So understanding the story is necessitated in part with understanding the Bible. And in fact, I'll say this many times throughout the course of the semester. Do you know your Bible? Because many pieces of literature are based on biblical stories. The biblical story of Solomon. And King Solomon is basically approached by two women who both claim to be the biological mother of a baby. And Solomon is unable to get them to resolve their dispute, so he decrees that the baby shall be cut in half, and each woman shall have half of the baby. That's the fair way to resolve it. And the biological mother steps forward and says, no, let the other woman have the baby. And King Solomon says to the woman who stepped forward, you must be the biological mother, because only a biological mother would put the welfare of her baby above her own needs and interests. And, that's the moral of the story. What we get with Raymond Carver is a modern retelling of that in the 1980s. And divorce is becoming more and more, dare I say, popular. One of the reasons for the title, Popular Mechanics. So this is very much an examination of some of the negative effects of divorce on the child, which might seem obvious to us in 2024, less so in the late 70s and early 80s, when again, divorce was just becoming commonplace or popular. So what we get is the story of what happens when you have two parents, two biological parents, who aren't willing to put the welfare of the child above their own welfare. Well, they tear that child in two, literally in this instance, but think about how that can happen figuratively and symbolically, by tearing a child in half emotionally with trying to get the child's allegiance, or physically in the sense of having a child live in two different locales, for part of the week in one and part of the week for the other. So, and about how ultimately divorces can tear families in half. All of these messages are embedded within the story. And again, it's not necessarily a message you have to agree with, just like in Battle Royal, there's their own messages about racism and classism and sexism. But I think in both of these pieces, it's pretty clear that the authors have a particular agenda. They want to do more than just entertain. They're trying to convince and persuade, but rather than do so by preaching, they're going to entertain through a story. Though, of course, both of these pieces are, I don't know if entertain is the correct word. They are disturbing, but they are interesting, and they certainly show a level of sophistication in terms of their writing and their character development that we wouldn't necessarily see in a piece of formulaic writing that would be written primarily for profit or for entertainment, and not necessarily for any other reason, such as social commentary. So we could have read stories forever. Obviously, we have to move beyond the fiction section to the drama section. But the good news is that many of the techniques that we've utilized in our fiction section, we can utilize in our drama section. For instance, looking at titles. So I had already suggested that popular mechanics, popular means common. If you look up the definition of mechanics, or one of the definitions of mechanics, it's two forces working against one another. And how nicely does that fit into the situation that we get in the story of a breakup or a couple that is splitting up, because the story is about splitting up. And you might even be familiar with the magazine, and at the time, publications like magazines were much more popular than they are today. But there is a publication, I think it still exists, at least in its online form, called Popular Mechanics. It's a kind of do-it-yourself magazine where it talks about how to fix things and how to make things. And note the irony that basically in the story we're basically being told how to break things apart. And through that use of the jagged dialogue, it seems almost like it's an instruction manual of how to break up something like a child or a family. So if you were reading the questions at the ending of the story, then you might have noted that the story was originally entitled Mine, which is pretty obvious as to why they would call that. I personally like the title Popular Mechanics better because it requires you to think, and it's not necessarily so obvious. But a lot of that is personal preference. And as we get ready to read drama, the good news is that we can utilize many of the same analytic skills that we've talked about thus far. Now, dramas, though, are different than short stories because they are meant to be performed. So in some ways, they're a lot more similar to film. The distinction being that dramas are meant to be performed live. And ideally, we would be watching the dramas that we are reading live. Logistically, that's too difficult, so we're going to watch film versions. And of course, as we talked about with filmed versions, there are additional layers there. For instance, the camera, for instance. So the camera is going to dictate what we see, as opposed to a live performance where we might see something unfold, but we get to decide where to direct our attention. Certainly, the lighting director and the director of the drama and the actors might be trying to direct our attention one way or another. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what we have to focus on. Just think about Citizen Kane and Roger Ebert's analysis of Citizen Kane, that with the Mrs. Scene, that you can have the entire scene in focus so that you can make decisions about where to focus your attention, and that while camera angles might influence where you're focusing your attention, Roger Ebert asked us to look a little bit beyond that so that we could see other elements that would also be clear in that image that would have some significance. So dramas are dialogue driven, and dramas are longer than short stories, just like films are longer than short stories. The result is that we are going to be reading fewer dramas than we would have read short stories. But the dramas are longer. And we have to remember that dramas were never meant to be read, they were meant to be performed, which means we have to watch performance. And in this instance, we're watching not live performance, but filmed performance. So that'll be the film component of the drama section. We will be reading 3 dramas in their entirety, but also watching 3 filmed performances of all 3 of the dramas, talking about the similarities to and the differences from. And obviously, what you've probably seen with reading is that you have the ability to really do some detailed analysis in a way that you might not when you're consuming something on film or live. So that is one of the reasons why we read a drama, even though it wasn't necessarily meant to be read but performed. Shakespeare's a great example, and that you're going to miss so much with just watching a performance. Though I think you will appreciate the play more by seeing a performance rather than reading it. That's the great irony. But you'll see that a good author is just as meticulous with their symbolism and their metaphor and their diction and all of the other elements that we've been looking at very closely in terms of language. And this means that when we are reading a drama, we have to understand that we need to try to envision how it would be enacted in stage. And of course, those are decisions that are going to be made by perhaps the playwright, but a lot of other people as well, such as director and actor and so forth. So we've got multiple layers of interpretation. And when we are reading these dramas, the pieces you're likely to want to skip are the pieces you want to pay the most attention to. The stage directions, for instance. Pay a lot of close attention to those stage directions. They're really the only information we're given about how it would have been acted on stage. The names of the characters, and usually stage directions and the names of the characters for their dialogue are in italics. Again, don't skip that. Spend a lot of time thinking about that, because if you're just reading a drama, it's going to be very easy to mix up the characters if you're not differentiating them by name when you're going through the dialogue. And we'll talk some more about drama. I can tell you what's ideal with drama, but I know the world isn't oftentimes ideal. But what's ideal is when we talk about our first drama, that you would have read it in its entirety, even though we've got multiple classes devoted to that particular drama, which is, for us, Oedipus the King. So that as we are talking about and watching Oedipus the King over several classes, you're at home reading the second drama, which happens to be Midsummer Night's Dream. So ideally, when we get to our second drama, even though we've got multiple classes devoted to it, you've already read A Midsummer Night's Dream in its entirety when we're talking about it and watching performance. And that means you're at home reading our third and final drama, which happens to be A Raisin in the Sun. And again, ideally, you would have finished reading A Raisin in the Sun in its entirety before we begin our conversations and watching performance, So that at that point, you don't need to be at home reading a drama. At that point, actually, you'll probably be working on your second paper and thinking about how you are going to write about drama. And I'm going to offer you the same prompts about canon and contemporary relevance, but you're also encouraged to create your own topic as long as it is based on one of the texts we're reading in class and as long as you have your topic approved by me. So, one of the things we'll be talking about over the next couple classes, in addition to some of the conventions with drama, is why it is that Oedipus the King is usually studied in a drama section, because it's a very old play, 430 BC old, and it's from a completely different culture, Greece, and it's written in another language, Greek, though of course we'll be reading an English translation. So why is it that that play is given so much respect and esteem? And it's quite important, not just from a historical perspective, but it's also important, I think, from a thematic perspective. But I can tell you this, that Oedipus the King is usually considered the standard for identifying what a tragedy is. And if you think about some of the great playwrights, Shakespeare's the first that comes to mind. We usually talk about Shakespeare in terms of his tragedies. It's much more rare to talk about Shakespeare in terms of, let's say, his history plays or his comedies. So, next class on Monday, do note that we are not meeting, and I will be putting this on our Moodle site as well, because that is Native Indigenous Day. So there are no classes. That gives you a little bit of extra time to work on reading our first drama, Oedipus the King, and also put some serious thought into paper number 1, because ultimately you have finished watching or reading all of the options for paper number 1. You can either write about the film, Citizen Kane, or one of the short stories that we've talked about. So for today's attendance question, because we're sort of in that bridge place, I'm going to offer you 2 questions and ask you to choose one. So you can choose one of the 2. You do not need to answer both. This will be due by Friday, the 11th. Of course, you can always ask me for an extension if you need additional time. And if you're moved to respond to your classmates, please do so, but you're not required to. You are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you an idea of the class discussion we would have had. So what are your 2 options for this discussion forum? Which, of course, if you need additional time, please ask me for an extension. Be happy to grant it for you. Either question number 1, what topic are you considering for paper number 1 and why? I had asked you this in terms of thinking about what text you were thinking about. Now I'm asking you about your topic. So we're starting to get a little bit more detailed now for that first paper. But if you're really not interested or ready to talk about paper number 1, you all can answer the second question, which is identify an important quote in either. So I leave you with the short stories that we've been discussing over the last several classes. Soldier's Home, Battle Royal, or Popular Mechanics. You can choose which short story you'd like. And identify an important quote from one of those short stories and indicate why it's important. So that basically gives you an opportunity to either put closure onto the fiction section through thinking about important quotation, or put closure on the fiction section by doing some serious thought about the first paper, which of course we will continue to discuss as the semester progresses. But we are moving at a clip right now, so before you know it, we will be at the 21st of October. Hard to believe, but it is true. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about reading drama and, of course, paper number 1. But it won't be happening on Monday. It is Native Indigenous Day. Instead, what we will be doing is talking about that on Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.